Hello, everyone. Good evening, and thank you so much for joining us for the second edition of the August Dan Schnur Political Report. I know you're used to seeing our president, Richard Downey, give the introduction, but he's currently in Panama with our delegation from LAWIC, so that's where he is tonight. I'm going to be taking his place. Just as some reminders, we have a bunch of upcoming events in September that you can register for on our website. On September 8th, we have a Cultural Bridges event with the Consulate of the Republic of Indonesia in Los Angeles. On September 10th, we have a members only brunch with the CEO of Chevron, Mike Wirth. On September 17th, we have the September edition of the Dan Schnur Political Report. And on September 19th, we have a luncheon with the former Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy. And finally, on September 26th, we have a premier member only luncheon with author Max Boot. Thank you so much for being here again. And if everything goes according to plan, I will be moderating our next session in September. But for now, please welcome our new programs manager, Krista Seitz, as our moderator today. And I'll turn this over to Krista and Dan.
Thank you very much, Maddie. And for those of you who haven't had a chance yet to meet Madison Alt, our terrific new communications manager, we're thrilled to have her on board. And Krista, thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to the LA World Affairs Council Town Hall. After that long, arduous trip up from Orange County, we're excited to have you as part of our Los Angeles team. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm looking forward to it. As Dan mentioned, I'm the new programs and events manager here at LA WAC and Town Hall, and looking forward to tonight's session.
So we do have quite a bit to talk about tonight, everyone. And as Madison correctly pointed out, this is our second political report of the month, just because there's been so much news that's happened in recent weeks. If you stop and think about it for a second, it has been 29 days, less than 1 month. It has been 29 days since Joe Biden announced that he was not going to seek re-election, and Kamala Harris announced her own candidacy. And the amount of political news and information that has flowed since then is far more than we could cover in 10 political reports, let alone 2 political reports. But just as a week and a half ago when we last met, we tried to give you an overview of the transition from Biden to Harris and what that meant to both the Democrats and the Republicans. Tonight, we want to focus much more specifically on the Democratic National Convention. So just like we did when the Republicans met in Milwaukee last month, of course, the Democrats are in Chicago now, from now until Thursday night, when Harris gives her acceptance speech, officially receiving the Democratic nomination for president. But these conventions, of course, as you all know, last for 4 full days, the better part of a week. The first night of the convention is tonight. Hillary Clinton is speaking. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is speaking. And of course, most notably, Joe Biden is speaking. And he's going to be giving a much, much different speech to this convention tonight than he assumed he would have been giving just a month ago, when he thought that he would be accepting the nomination rather than paving the way for Harris to move forward. So quite a bit going on over the next 4 days, Krista. We got a lot to cover tonight, don't we?
Yes, we do, definitely. Thank you for providing that overview. The first question I want to ask is, how is this convention going to be different than if Biden were the nominee?
Well, it's a really, really good question. And I think, and one of the most interesting things that's been taking place, at least for those of us who've worked on political campaigns in the past, is how much the Democratic National Convention staff has had to fundamentally reorient this convention over the last 4 weeks. Because, of course, just as they were preparing for a different nominee, that meant the convention was going to be very different in terms of tone, in terms of content, in terms of participants. So all sorts of changes than we might have seen if Biden would have been accepting the nomination for his re-election. I think the first thing to note, and this is a direct reflection of the change in public opinion polls that have taken place since Harris announced her candidacy, is it's very clear that we're going to see a much more energized Democratic convention and a much more optimistic group of Democratic delegates than would have been the case otherwise. Public opinion polls, as all of you remember, in late July showed Trump running with a small but fairly consistent lead in the key swing states over Biden And even before the debate that ultimately led to Biden's decision to step away from the ticket, a lot of Democrats were approaching this campaign, it appeared to me, approaching the general election campaign in somewhat almost of a dutiful way. This is an obligation. The Democrats, were very committed, of course, to doing everything they could to keep Trump from regaining the White House. But there wasn't a great deal of energy. There wasn't a great deal of enthusiasm. And that has changed. So I think we'll see a much livelier convention hall tonight and through the week. And I think you'll hear speakers that are talking, as I said a moment ago, in much more heightened and inspirational and optimistic tones about their candidate. Now, on one hand, that's a great thing to have going for you. An energized party is more often than not a successful party. But already, smart Democrats are starting to offer cautionary notes. And what they've pointed out correctly is they say, look, Kamala Harris has had the most successful 4 weeks of any presidential candidate in modern history. Donald Trump has had the worst 4 weeks, arguably, of any presidential candidate in the modern era. And yet the race is still all but tied. So it will be a different convention, a much more energized and optimistic one. What we won't know for weeks to come is whether that energy and that optimism ends up resulting in a more successful candidacy for Harris. That's not going to be decided between now and Thursday night. One thing in particular, and we'll talk more later on, of course, about Biden's speech and about Harris's speech, but when we talk about the difference in tone, there's something in particular worth keeping an eye on throughout the week and moving forward. Biden, for most of the last year or so, has very regularly warned the American people about what he feels is a threat to democracy that Donald Trump poses should Trump regain the White House. And ardent Democrats, of course, agree with that assessment. But if you think about it, it's a very dour message. It's a warning that horrible things will happen if we don't act. Harris, while she certainly does not shy away from criticism of Trump, doesn't center her message around the threat to democracy that Trump presents. And she talks much more about freedoms, about moving forward. And so it is a more positive message. Again, there'll be plenty of opportunity Thursday night and for the next several weeks for her to very harshly criticize the former president. But at the core of the message is one that is less dangerous and one that is much more optimistic. And then lastly, and then I'm be eager to bring Maddie back to see our first poll question. The other thing to keep in mind as you watch the convention over the next few days is that the speakers, by and large, will be talking to different voters than they might have spoken to if Biden were still on track to be the nominee. And what I mean by that is this. Biden's key to victory over Trump was winning back the white working class voters in the upper Midwest, in Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania, that he had taken from Trump in 2020, who in turn Trump had taken from Hillary Clinton in 2016. Those were the voters who were going to decide this election. Well, over the last 4 weeks, Harris has caught and, according to some polls, passed Donald Trump in the polls, not by concentrating on those older white working class voters, but rather by concentrating on motivating and mobilizing young people, non-white voters, female voters. These are constituencies that Biden was winning against Trump, but by not nearly the margin he would need to win an entire election. And so Harris, by motivating those traditional Democratic constituencies, she and the other speakers are going to be talking to them much more directly tonight than you might have heard from a Biden-led convention. So all sorts of differences, and that really touches on, I think, many others that we'll talk about a little bit later. But before I go any further, I'd like to ask Maddie to put up the first poll question for all of you to consider. And we're going to narrow our focus here from the convention as a whole. We're going to narrow our focus, as you can see here, specifically to Kamala Harris and her speech on Thursday night. So here's our question for you. What do you believe is the most important thing? What's the most important goal for Harris to accomplish at the convention? Number one, to introduce herself as a person. She's obviously not nearly as well known as Joe Biden. Number two, to explain her professional and her political achievements over the course of her career. Number 3, to outline her policy goals for the future, should she be elected president. 4th, should she concentrate primarily on drawing contrasts with Donald Trump? Or 5th, and finally, all of the above. And Maddie, when we have our answer to that one, if you can put them up, because we'll be eager to see it. Oh, I love this new feature that shows the numbers being counted in real time. 50% of us, 50% of you believe that she should try to accomplish all of the above. But let's look at the rest of that. 37% of you, which if we do the math, that's roughly 3/4 of those who only chose one topic. 3/4 of you said the most important thing for her to do is to outline her policy goals for the future. And there's no question, the majority of Americans don't know much about Harris. But it's interesting to you and how forward-looking you are, because only 6% talked about drawing contrasts with Trump. Only 5% said she needed to introduce herself as a person. Only 2% said to explain her professional and political achievements. Really, really interesting. And Krista, I think you'd agree with me that that's sort of an unfair question that we've put to our group. Because as they correctly pointed out, Harris doesn't have the luxury of just doing one of those things. She has to do all of them. The challenge is even in a convention speech watched by a national audience, there's a limited window of opportunity for a speaker to get a message across. And a speaker who tries to cover too many topics in a speech ends up not making much of an impression on any of them. So I guess it was somewhat of an unfair question we asked our group, but they should be used to that from me by now. But it is interesting, don't you think, to watch how much our group was looking for her to talk about the future rather than about the past.
Yes, very interesting how they focused on the future policy and rather not as much as her professional achievements nor her personal life as well. But I want to know from you, out of all these goals mentioned, which one do you think is the most important?
Okay. Well, I would go with our group because they're usually pretty smart on this stuff, in that she does need to concentrate on her policy specifics, because until just last Friday, when she began to lay out the beginnings of an economic agenda, most voters don't know a great deal about the issues she intends to emphasize and how she intends to talk about them, not just in the campaign, but if she is elected president. But I would put one twist on our group's response. It is important for her to talk about the future, but she really does have to find a way, when she's talking about the policies she's going to focus on, she needs to introduce herself as well, if only to convince a national audience, not only that she understands the issues and the challenges the country faces, but she needs to convince a national audience that she has the credibility and she has the experience to take on these issues in a meaningful and successful way. So one of the things you've already seen her do on the campaign trail is Harris talks quite a bit about being a prosecutor, which is part of her political and her professional biography. She's attempting to say to voters, hey, I know how to deal with these issues, and particularly on policy matters like crime and immigration, issues that generally have really worked very successfully for Republican candidates, by talking about her own record on those issues as a district attorney, as the Attorney General of California, and in the Senate. Even while she's talking about her policy goals, she's introducing herself as well. But I would say this, and again, I think this is what we saw in our group's response also. When Harris is introducing herself, in order to provide the framework for that policy discussion, she should be, and I suspect she will be, focusing on her professional and her political achievements much more than her personal identity. When Barack Obama ran for president, he said afterwards that he didn't spend a lot of time talking about the history-making nature of his candidacy, because as Obama himself said, he said, people could see that I was Black. I didn't need to spend a lot of time talking about it. And I think that Harris and the people around her have come to the same conclusion, both about her gender and her racial and ethnic heritage, that it's not something she has to spend a lot of time talking about, that may be right now the one thing that voters do understand about her. That said, not in Harris's speech itself, But at some point during the convention, either right before she speaks or during the few days leading up to her speech, tonight or Tuesday or Wednesday, I suspect the Democrats have hastily produced a video that talks much more about Kamala Harris's personal biography, her upbringing, her childhood, her young adulthood, her professional career. For those of you with long memories, or those of you who are as older than I am, you may remember that in 1992, when a relatively unknown Democratic nominee, Bill Clinton, was preparing to address the Democratic National Convention, his campaign had also produced a video, and a couple of Hollywood producers put together a biographical video about Bill Clinton called A Man from Hope. And because most voters didn't know a lot about Clinton at that point, they knew that he hadn't gone to Vietnam, they knew that he'd been at Oxford, they knew about some of his alleged extramarital relationships, and they had concluded from those factoids, the majority of voters, according to Clinton campaign polling, they had concluded that Bill Clinton was a child of privilege, that he'd grown up as the child of wealthy parents. That was obviously not that was obviously not his experience. And so the campaign realized, well, it'd be difficult for Clinton to talk about that himself. If they produced a video, this video, A Man from Hope, they could reintroduce Bill Clinton to the American people. And I would not be surprised at all that either Thursday night right before Harris speaks, the way they did with Clinton back in the 90s, or as early as tonight, if the American people didn't hear, not from Kamala Harris's own mouth in her own words, but rather saw a video about her that talks about her background and her upbringing in a way that not many people are familiar with. The one other thing, Krista, that I'd say about what Harris needs to accomplish is it's important, as it is for any presidential nominee, to remember that they're not really speaking to the people in the hall, in the auditorium, in the United Center in this case, but rather they're talking to the American people. Now, just like a Republican convention audience is much, much more conservative than the overall American electorate, a Democratic convention attendees are far more liberal than the electorate as a whole. So it's always tempting to give a speech in the hall, in the auditorium, that really raises the crowd's ire, that gets the crowd excited. Yeah, a good red meets exciting motivational speech. But if Harris is smart, and she appears, and I think and she certainly is, but if Harris is smart, she will not give her speech as much to the people in the room with her, but remember that she's talking to a much larger and a much broader and a much more ideologically diverse audience around the country. If she keeps that in mind, she's much more likely to accomplish the goals that we've been discussing. So we're going to go back, Madison, if we can, to our group. We've already asked them what they thought Harris's goal should be for the convention. Now we're going to broaden this back out again, and we're going to make this a much simpler question for all of you. There's just two options here. What should the Democrats be doing this week? Number one, should they be emphasizing their record and goals, policy, issues, ideology, and so on? Or alternatively, should they be criticizing Trump's record and his goals that he's laid out for the future? So pretty simple, straightforward question. Should the Democrats be pushing a positive message or a negative question? And we know, of course, that ultimately it'll end up being both. But what's the emphasis you'd like to see? Wow, look at that. 91% of you want to see a positive message out of this convention. Only 9% say that you think that the top priority ought to be criticism of Trump and the Republicans. And I will take the liberty of guessing here, but that if Biden, this goes back to something we were talking about at the beginning of the discussion tonight, if Joe Biden were still the Democratic nominee, I suspect that those poll numbers would be much, much different. Because when we did look at public opinion polling taken before Biden withdrew from the race, what we saw was that large majorities of his supporters were motivated primarily not by support for Biden, but by their opposition for Trump. And now that we're seeing Harris as the soon-to-be nominee, the polls are showing the exact opposite. Most Harris supporters say that they're supporting her, they're voting for her because they like her, because they support her. And smaller numbers still out of dislike and opposition to Trump. Now, obviously, for every voter, it's a combination of the two, but that shift is notable, and it's something we're seeing not just among the American voters writ large, but among our own group. So very, very notable. The thing we wanted to talk about with the time that we have left is, of course, Kamala Harris is not the only speaker at the convention. And the last question that you all answered alluded to that, because we weren't just talking about Harris. We're talking about 4 nights of programming. And these 4 nights are pretty crowded. For the first time in many, many years, we're actually hearing from 3 presidents, Obama, Clinton, and Biden, speak to this convention. That's happened before, but what's never happened is having 3 presidents speak, none of whom were their party's nominee. So Biden is speaking tonight. Obama is talking tomorrow night, Clinton on Wednesday night, and Kamala Harris, of course, on Thursday. But in addition to the 3 presidents, no shortage of other political leaders, celebrities. It is a very crowded schedule. And what the Democrats need to do, in addition to the balance between a positive message about their own goals and criticism of Trump and the opposition party, the more challenging balance for them to pull off is a balance between motivating their base, getting loyal core Democrats very excited and very inspired, but also finding a way to reach out to undecided voters. Now, up until now, for the last 29 days, Harris has done a masterful job, and we talked about this a little bit in our last webinar. Harris has done a masterful job over the last 4 weeks of motivating the Democratic base. She's brought back those young people. She's brought back those non-white voters. She's brought back these female voters and other progressives who were sort of lukewarm on Biden. But what we haven't seen from Harris yet is an ongoing effort to reach out to swing voters in the middle of the political spectrum. We will see some of that this convention week, probably not a great deal, but starting next week, that becomes her challenge going forward. But knowing that the Democrats over 4 days have these 2 goals, 1, to motivate their existing support base, and number 2, to reach beyond it, to persuade undecided voters. Maddie, let's put up poll question number 3. Given those twin goals and sometimes conflicting goals of the convention, who's the most important speaker this week other than Harris? They've got to motivate their base. They've got to convince undecideds. They have to portray a positive agenda going forward, but there will be hefty criticism of Trump. So this is 5 out of probably 50 names we could have put up here. But Joe Biden, Barack Obama, Nancy Pelosi, Hillary Clinton, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez were the 5 alternatives that Maddie and I picked out. And while there are certainly other important speakers, which of these 5 do you think is the most important voice the American people will hear from this week, other than Harris herself? 70%, more than 2/3, look at that, more than 2/3 of our group believes that Obama is giving the most important speech. 16% say Joe Biden. And Biden has a real challenge tonight, make no mistake about it. And I imagine we'll talk about it a lot in the second half hour when we get to your questions. Pelosi, and even less than that, Ocasio-Cortez and Clinton barely received any support at all. So it sounds like, at least from our group, all eyes will be on Barack Obama tomorrow night. Now, thank you, Maddie. Very interesting results. So, Krista, again, in 3 hours of convention programming over the course of 4 nights, 12 hours of programming, we only gave them 5 names. And that probably wasn't that fair. But I was struck at how overwhelmingly our group said that Barack Obama was the most important speaker to address the country. And even Biden, given the fact that his speech tonight will be historical in all sorts of ways, got much less of a response than that. Interesting results, though, didn't you think?
Yes, very interesting. I was also debating between Biden, Obama, and AOC myself. I was surprised that AOC didn't receive as much, because she does represent more of the younger voters, the more progressive voters that maybe Kamala would like to have, but definitely agree with Obama. So I want to ask you, since there are 3 presidents speaking this week, What is their role at the convention? What are Biden, Obama, and Clinton seeking to accomplish?
Uh, and maybe we should have included Bill Clinton on that list. But I agree with you about Ocasio-Cortez before we get to the presidents. And I'd offer you this thought, if I can, Krista. I think because Harris has done such a better job of motivating Democratic loyalists than Biden had been able to, I wonder if Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and other more progressive voices are less critical to the Democratic strategy now than they might have been if Biden was still the nominee. In other words, if the progressives who those voices were going to fire up are already fired up for Harris herself, maybe it's not as important, and maybe that reflected some of the results we saw. As far as the three presidents, Biden, as I mentioned a moment ago, his speech tonight is historic. Other presidents have just chosen not to run for re-election, but you have to go back to Chester Arthur to find a president of the United States who had been announced a declared candidate for president of the United States and then withdrew in mid-race. Even Lyndon Johnson, when he announced that he would not seek re-election in March of 1968, that was several months before the Democratic convention that year, and he had not officially announced his candidacy. So it's pretty rare for a president to step back like this. And I believe that a couple of things to watch for tonight, and Biden will not be talking until the 7 o'clock hour, our time in California. So I promise we won't keep you from that. On one hand, it's going to be very poignant for Joe Biden. Biden spent half a century of public life working to become president of the United States. And he came up short several times. And by the time he finally got there, the cruel joke played on him is that the voters and many of his strongest supporters decided that by the time he got to the presidency, that he was too old to hold it for a second term. And it's been well chronicled, well reported. We've all read the stories about how difficult this has been for Biden. But when he speaks tonight, it'll be interesting to see how he conducts himself. He'll obviously give huge praise to Harris. He'll obviously give huge thanks to the delegates and the American people. And my guess is the delegates will go out of their way to show him as rousing a thank you as they possibly can, to reassure him that they look at him as someone who did something very noble and very valuable. But it'll be interesting to watch how he conducts himself emotionally, because while on one hand, this is going to be an upbeat speech, I think we all have a sense of how much regret he feels. And if you think that Joe Biden's speech is going to be interesting in that regard, let's see Jill Biden too, because it's been reported that she is not happy about the way this has all played out either. And as perhaps a less practiced public speaker, she's just as effective a politician as her husband, but as a less frequent public speaker, it'll be interesting to see if her emotions seep through it all. Obama is the most popular politician in America today, and he has been by some time. So I suspect that's another reason why our group may have pointed to him as the person they were most interested in hearing from. And Obama's job, of course, will be to build a bridge in the voter's mind between his presidency and a potential Kamala Harris presidency. Again, people don't know much about her, just like they didn't know much about Senator Barack Obama in 2008. So it's his job almost to reassure them that Harris will be a continuation of what he and Biden accomplished in their respective presidencies. Clinton, though, and it's worth noting that Clinton is speaking on Wednesday night, even though he's not as popular as Obama is these days. Clinton is speaking later in the convention than Obama because Clinton talks to swing voters, and more effectively than any Democrat in recent history. Bill Clinton has been extraordinarily talented at talking to middle-of-the-road, undecided voters, particularly those who are more economically populist and somewhat culturally conservative. This is Clinton's wheelhouse. And he's obviously much older than he was in 2008 and 2012. Hillary Clinton's campaign, for those of you who remember, actually took him off the campaign trail at one point because he was really struggling. But Clinton is an unusually gifted, a historically gifted communicator. smart people I know would say that Clinton and Reagan are probably the two best presidential communicators going back to since Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And when Bill Clinton spoke at the Democratic Convention in 2012, when Barack Obama was running for re-election, Clinton was able to crystallize the Obama message, frankly, more effectively than Obama himself was. Obama referred to Bill Clinton as, quote, the secretary of splaining himself, or excuse me, the secretary of splaining stuff. And what Clinton's real gift is being able to explain complicated matters in fairly straightforward terms. So I don't have any sense as to whether he's still up to that or not. But as important as Obama's speech is tomorrow night, keep an eye on Clinton on Wednesday too, because I think it'll be instructive to see what he can accomplish. Maddie, let's go to our next poll question. We're running a little bit behind time here, so I'm going to pick up the pace. But let's go to our next question. There we go. One person we haven't talked about tonight among all these speakers, among the three presidents and Hillary Clinton and Jill Biden and Michelle Obama and Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders and all the rest, we haven't talked about the running mate. So question for our group, how important will Tim Walz's speech be to the convention? Very important, somewhat unimportant, or not important? Interesting. 40, only slightly more of you say very important than somewhat important. But if we break this down into two, with those top two categories, very and somewhat important, being a more positive impression, we'd say, and somewhat unimportant or not important, being somewhat more dismissive, 89% of our group believes that the Walz speech will really matter. And it's still a little bit too early to tell how much of a difference either Tim Walz or J.D. Vance are going to make in this election over the next several weeks. But it is worth noting, and it's worth keeping in mind when Walz gives his acceptance speech on Wednesday night, that his job in this campaign is to reach out to those rural and small town voters across America in areas where the Democrats have really suffered in recent years. As I said a moment ago, Bill Clinton always spoke to those voters very successfully, but that was a long time ago. So we'll see if Tim Walz can pick up that charge going forward. Now, Krista, I don't know about you, but I was a little bit surprised, as I told the group, when Tim Walz was picked as Harris's running mate. But there are so many other people on the stage between now and Thursday night when Harris gives her speech. Are you going to be able to watch much of it?
I do want to be able to watch it tonight or during the day that we have it, but I wanted to know, besides Tim Walz, you mentioned a couple of them before, but who are the other important speakers we should be watching for during this convention?
Well, I think there are quite a few, but those in particular who I'll emphasize, aside from the presidents and the running mate, is just as the Democrats are about to nominate a woman of color to be president for the first time in our nation's history, there's a number of other female speakers this week who are particularly important. As I mentioned earlier, Hillary Clinton is speaking tonight. And it's been reported that actually she and Kamala Harris have developed a very strong relationship since Harris first came to Washington to serve in the U.S. Senate back in 2017. Michelle Obama, who was not a big fan of Joe Biden's and generally tended to keep her distance from a lot of Biden campaign events, is also much more enthusiastic about Harris. So her speech will be very, very interesting to watch. As I said earlier, Jill Biden's talk tonight, and particularly when she talks about her husband, who at least privately she believed has not received the respect that he deserves. Her speech will be particularly emotional and particularly poignant. Plenty of other women worth pointing to. Nancy Pelosi, of course, who aside from her historic time as Speaker of the House of Representatives, is arguably the most important voice in forcing Biden from the race. Pelosi will be speaking. We already talked about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. No shortage of other important speakers to watch. But once again, I'll go back to what I said earlier. Except for Harris's speech itself, the most important thing to watch this week is not another speaker, but watch the biographical video that the convention shows of Kamala Harris. I don't know, and the news might have come out since we began our webinar. I don't know if it's airing tonight. I don't know if it's airing right before her speech, the way it did for Bill Clinton back in 1992. But there's going to be a video that introduces Kamala Harris to the American people on personal grounds before she talks about her political and policy goals. And I'd say that except for Harris's speech, that's the most important thing to watch this week. And so lastly, we're going to go to one more poll question because, and before you put it up, Maddie, if I can just give a little bit of background. The other thing that's really important to watch this week, of course, is what's happening outside the United Center. And already today, we saw fairly spirited protests, smaller than had been predicted, but very aggressive protests against various aspects of the Democratic agenda. Most notably, though, protests against the Biden administration's conduct in the war in Gaza. And because so many progressive Democrats fiercely oppose the Biden administration's approach to the Middle East and ongoing support for Israel, it's been rumored for some time that those protests could become incredibly disruptive. And of course, the fact that this convention is taking place in the city of Chicago, where famously back in 1968, protesters not only redefined the convention, but redefined the election between Richard Nixon and Hubert Humphrey. The ghosts of 1968 are at least potentially lingering around the outskirts of the city of Chicago. So one last question for the group, if we can, Maddie. What do you think about the protests? It's going to be a few more days. So we're still predicting here, but how much of an impact do you believe the protests will have on the convention? Do you think they'll help the party a lot? Do you think they'll help the party a little? Do you think they'll hurt the party a little? Do you think they'll hurt the party a lot, or they won't make any difference? Where do you think the protests are going? Looks like we might be a little bit stuck on the responses, and up to there. All right, 50% believe that the protests will hurt a little bit. But add to that will hurt the party a lot response is 15%. That means 65% of our group believes that the protests will have a detrimental effect on the party and the convention. Only 1% of you say that the protests will help the party a lot, 5% help a little, 29% say no difference. But it is worth noting almost 2/3 of our group believe that the protests will hurt the Democrats over the course of the week. And of course, this is one of Harris's biggest challenges, not just in the convention, Krista, but over the course of her candidacy, correct?
Yes, and I wanted to ask you, what are the key differences in the way Harris will be approaching this issue as compared to Biden?
Well, we are somewhat over time, and we do want to get to our audience questions. So I'll give you a quick answer, and then hopefully we can get back to this in response to some of the really smart questions and comments that we get from our group during the latter portion of the program. But what I'd offer you briefly is this. The most important thing to know is that, at least to date, there's no substantive difference whatsoever between Harris and Biden on Middle Eastern policy, at least as it relates to the Gaza war. It is worth noting, it's important to note, that Harris has adopted a much different tone. For a long time now, long before she became a candidate herself 29 days ago, Harris talked much more forcefully about the need for a ceasefire. Biden supported a ceasefire, of course, he still does, but Harris was much more emphatic in what she felt was the need for it. And Harris also has always put a much greater amount of emphasis on the situation faced by the Palestinian people living in Gaza. And so by talking about the plight of Palestinians caught in the war between Hamas and Israel, she's offering a level of not substantive difference, but of personal empathy, if you will, toward those caught in the middle. And it's the Harris team's hope that those tonal differences will give her some more leeway with the strongest critics of the Biden administration's conduct throughout the war. So far, that doesn't seem to be the case. So we have gone long, and I'll apologize to all of you for that. But Krista, what do you say we move on to the next portion of the program, even if it's a little
Of
bit
course.
belatedly?
Yes, thank you for your insights. So now we are going to move to an on-screen question submitted by Melissa Wilson, who's a longtime viewer and a Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall member. Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you, Krista, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. Hi, Dan.
Melissa, it's great to see you. Thanks so much for joining us.
It's great to see you too. Thank you. And I was just wondering, if you were in a room with Kamala right now, what advice would you give her to run the most successful campaign possible?
Well, it's a really smart question. And I think one of the challenges for a candidate that most of us can't appreciate, it's what it's like to have not just one person, but a dozen or more people in a room all telling you exactly what you need to do. And often the advice isn't even that advice is often contradictory, which makes it even more difficult. But I'd go back to a couple of things I said earlier. Number one, to remind her that her most important audience is not at the United Center. Her most important audience is not in the auditorium in Chicago. It's out around the country. And particularly when talking about difficult issues like crime and immigration, the way she talks about those issues in a way that's going to appeal to the swing voters she needs to win the election are going to be much different than what would excite and inspire the people who are actually attending the convention. And I would encourage her to be willing to forego even a few applause lines in order to get a necessary message out on those challenging issues to the broader electorate. One thing we haven't talked about at all tonight, it might be the first time all year in a webinar, we have not mentioned the word abortion 40 minutes into the program. But as much in crime and immigration are issues which historically have helped Republicans, the abortion issue is, in my mind, the most important key to a potential Harris victory. And she can talk about that in a much, much, much more impactful way than Biden has been able to over the course of her career. So I'd say rouse the crowd on issues relating to abortion and other social and cultural issues, but be willing to look beyond the room, be willing to look beyond the delegates themselves to reach out to a broader audience in order to win over those swing voters. Really interesting, Melissa. Are you considering a career change to political consultant? Is that what's...
No, I'm considering listening to you every single month. I'm learning more.
You're very, very nice.
Thanks again. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you for being here. And just as a reminder, as I think most of you know by now, is for those of you who are members, when our program finishes at 6 o'clock every month, we then spend an extra 30 minutes with our members only. And that conversation, instead of it being, in this case, Krista, reading questions from you to me, that members only half an hour is a conversation where, just like Melissa was now, we're all on screen together, talking back and forth. And for those of you who haven't yet joined the World Affairs Council Town Hall, that's one reason to do so. And for those of you who have joined but haven't signed up for our post-game shows, we'd love to have you.
Yeah, so thank you, Melissa, for asking that wonderful question. Now I want to submit the first question from the audience member. How can Harris go about discussing issues where she does not agree with Biden's current policy without causing conflict in her current role as vice president?
Well, once the convention is over, while she would obviously still remain vice president of the United States, at that point, her own beliefs need to take precedence. This week is probably the last time that we'll see her adhering to a Biden administration line on which she's not completely comfortable. It'll be worthwhile to watch her on Thursday night, particularly listening for any kind of distancing. We've talked a couple times tonight about the 1968 campaign, in which a embattled president, Lyndon Johnson, chose not to seek re-election, and his loyal vice president, Hubert Humphrey, ultimately lost the general election campaign to his opponent, Richard Nixon. Remember that throughout this Chicago convention in 1968, throughout all the protests, throughout all the chaos, throughout all the tumult that arguably helped cost Humphrey that election, Humphrey stuck to the Johnson administration position on Vietnam. It wasn't until more than a month later, at the end of September, when Humphrey finally came out and called for an end to the bombing of North Vietnam. My guess is that if Harris has issues on which she has kept her disagreements with Biden quiet for all the appropriate reasons for the last 3.5 years, I would be very, very surprised if we don't learn more about those differences in the next few weeks. I don't think she's going to wait much longer at all.
Thank you for that. So next I wanted to ask, do you believe that the Harris-Walz ticket will be able to effectively attract swing voters, particularly those who leaned right in the last election?
We don't know. And that will be the campaign's greatest challenge going forward. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, Harris has done an incredibly successful job of remotivating and re-engaging the Democratic base. And that's pulled her even or maybe given her a slight lead. And given the vagaries of the Electoral College, Harris's slight lead in the popular vote does not necessarily translate to a small win in the Electoral College and therefore in the presidential election. So for all practical purposes, this race is tied or close to be tied. And while she does need to continue to motivate those loyal Democrats over the next 2.5, 3 months, ultimately she does have to win over the swing voters. Walz, as I mentioned earlier, was named to the ticket precisely so he could reach out to a rural and small town voter cohort that has slipped away from Democrats in recent years. But there are arguments that some of the other candidates being considered, most notably Senator Kelly from Arizona and Governor Shapiro from Pennsylvania, would have been able to help Harris reach out to the center more effectively. So we'll see. Harris has to do two things to win this election. She's done one, starting either Thursday night or Friday morning. We'll see how well she answers the question our audience member asked.
Yes, wonderful. And on the topic of third-party candidates like RFK Jr., do you think he or others will have a significant impact on these elections?
Well, Robert Kennedy Jr.'s poll numbers have absolutely plummeted since Harris announced her candidacy. We've talked in these webinars in the past about the concept of double haters. And these are voters who can't stand either candidate and generally vote for the one who they hate the least. Or alternatively, a lot of these double haters will look for a third party or minor party candidate to support. In a Trump versus Biden campaign, the number of double haters reached almost 25% of the electorate. And that in turn elevated Kennedy and some of the other minor candidates in the polls. Because there's a lot fewer voters, particularly on the left, who don't like either candidate now, Harris, and that's where Harris's rise in the polls has come from. There's not nearly as much room left for Kennedy, for Jill Stein, the Green Party nominee, for Cornel West, the academic who's also running for president. So I don't think they're going to be drawing a lot of support. Kennedy's support in the polls is down to 2 or 3% after having been at over 15% last spring. But it's worth remembering that in a closely contested race, they don't need to get a lot of votes to have a huge impact. And so even 1%, 2%, very small percentages of the electorate in key swing states who opt for a minor party candidate could swing an election if Harris and Trump are running that close. There are still a lot of Democrats who believe that Jill Stein's votes in Wisconsin cost Hillary Clinton the presidency. There are Republicans who believe that the Libertarian Party candidates' support in a couple of states kept Donald Trump from winning in 2020. And of course, the memory of Ralph Nader still lingers over presidential politics, even 24 years later. So will the third-party candidates attract as many votes as they would have in a Trump-Biden race? Certainly not. But that doesn't mean that their impact couldn't be extraordinary.
I definitely agree with you there. So, Dan, we know that Harris is a politically shrewd and capable candidate, but is there any validity to the assertion that she may not be able to hold her own against Trump, especially given that she was not, quote unquote, tested in a primary?
Well, we don't know. And as we talked about a little bit in the webinar a couple weeks ago, a lot of Democrats, even those who thought that Biden should step down, believe that there should have been an even extremely abbreviated debate or primary or some type of competitive process through which the nominee was picked, so that the delegates and other Democrats could select among several candidates the one who they thought would be best equipped to take on Trump in a general election. Obviously, that didn't happen. There wasn't time for that. And so while on one hand, that decision to forego a competitive process allowed for the party to unify and energize in a way that it would not have otherwise, Harris is still, and this goes back to our previous question, Harris is still an untested candidate in a lot of ways. Again, we now know that she excels at motivating the Democratic Party base. We don't know how she'll do in interviews or in news conferences, and we don't know how she'll do in the debate stage. She certainly brings more energy to the debate stage than Biden would. And so there's a potential advantage for her right there. But Trump has been through this a number of times. And while he's been stumbling more than a bit on the campaign trail recently, we don't know how Harris will respond to his attacks until they happen. And the nice thing about our next webinar, shameless plug, is that we're meeting on September 17th next month, exactly 1 week after the only scheduled Trump-Harris debate. So we moved back a little bit further in September than normal so we could talk about the debate and its immediate aftermath after it happens, rather than speculating. And at that point, Krista, on September 17th, I'll feel much more comfortable and much more confident answering that last question. How's that for the Howard's way out?
Thank you. There are a significant number of DNC delegates who are currently pledging to remain uncommitted unless Kamala Harris adjusts her stance on Israel and Palestine. Do you believe these delegates will have an impact on her performance at the convention?
Well, there's a very small number of delegates, I think roughly 30, who are attending the convention who are uncommitted to Harris or any other candidate, of course. And the Democratic National Committee and the Harris campaign has been working furiously, meeting with these uncommitted delegates to attempt to convince them not to cause any type of disruption or distraction. Some of those delegates have agreed. A lot of others haven't. And what's worth noting, this is just a complete coincidence, but for those of you who are thinking back to the primary season when Biden was losing some of these uncommitted delegates, the state in which there are more uncommitted delegates than any other is the state of Minnesota. And through tradition in both parties' conventions, the home state of the nominee and the home state of the running mate get the best seats in the House front and center at the convention. So had Harris picked another running mate, the Minnesota delegation would have been way in the back of the United Center, and the 10 or the 12 or the 15 uncommitted delegates probably wouldn't have gotten noticed much at all. But now, because Kamala Harris's running mate, Tim Walz, is from Minnesota, they're going to be right up front. And so if they decide to make a scene, create a scene either during Harris's speech or otherwise, we don't know how much of an impact it'll have, but it'll be much more difficult for the convention to ignore it.
So I think we have time for one more question before we wrap things up. How important is it for Kamala Harris to address Project 2025? Is it an effective use of her speaking time?
Well, Project 2025 is all of you know, is the document prepared by the conservative think tank, the Heritage Foundation, which lays out a very aggressive and very conservative agenda for a Trump presidency. Trump has completely disavowed the document, but he's had very close relationships in the past with many of its authors. I would say this, our group earlier told us that they thought the convention should be much more about selling the Democratic message and the Democratic agenda than criticizing the Republican platform. And I would include Project 2025 in that. So I don't know that it's necessary to spend a lot of time on that document in particular. If I were advising Harris, going back to Melissa's question a little while ago, I would encourage her and her team not to criticize Project 2025, the document or the concept, but rather to criticize the policy content of the document and of Trump's own policy declarations. I think a candidate on either side, Democrat or Republican, is a lot more likely to impact voters' thinking by talking about why their opponent is wrong on a particular issue than talking in more general terms like a Project 25, a reference that not a lot of voters are going to get, are going to understand. So Maddie, if you're okay with it, what do you say? If I promise to give a really quick answer, can we let it Krista ask one more question?
I think we've got time for it.
Okay. Krista, can we do one more?
Yes, of course. So, do you feel that other speakers' contributions at the convention would be more strongly received as meaningful in persuading voters if they stated that they would be actively involved, such as getting a cabinet position in the new administration?
Well, that's a really interesting question because the speculation about some of the most powerful people in either party, Democrat or Republican, is the potential for them to serve in a president's cabinet. And certainly some of the most notable speakers this week, with the notable exception of Bill Clinton and Barack Obama and Joe Biden, are going to be speculated about as potential cabinet members. I don't think it makes sense for them to bring that up. And I'll tell you why. That if I'm speaking to the convention because I believe that Krista Seitz should be the next president of the United States, I'm giving that speech because I believe in my candidate and I believe in her goals. If I say I'm supporting Krista Seitz because she's going to give me this really neat job if she wins, I'm not sure that's as impactful for voters. So there's all sorts of speculation, which will take place over the course of the week. But the people who are the objects of that speculation, I think do best to keep their mouths shut about it, both on stage and off. Okay. See, Maddie, I told you I could give a shorter answer. You didn't think so.
Listen, I'm really impressed.
Okay.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both so much. I want to give a big thank you to Dan as always, and also to Krista for being our last minute moderator. Really happy to have her on, and
We
hopefully,
sure are.
yes, she's a rock star. Hopefully next time I'll be able to hop in and do just that. Dan, any closing remarks? Anything you want to say before we end?
Yeah. I want to thank you, Maddie. I want to thank you, Krista, both for doing a terrific job. I know we've thrown you into the deep end on these things, but I know our audience, I know our group would agree that you've both been terrific. But as much as I want to thank both Madison Alt and Krista Seitz for their great work, I want to even more thank the group that gathers with us every month. I want to thank Melissa Wilson and our fellow members who have been loyally with us for over 4 years now. And for those of you who are a little bit newer to this, we're thrilled to have you. So we hope you'll all be back with us on September 17th to sort through the Trump-Harris debate together. And for those of you who are members, we'll look forward to seeing you in our post-game show in just a few minutes. But thank you all for being with us. We all greatly appreciate it. And we hope that you'll be back again next month and that you'll take advantage of the opportunity to participate in other LA World Affairs Council town hall events, such as the type that Madison was talking about a little bit earlier. Hope you all enjoy the convention this week, and we'll look forward to talking again soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. And please don't forget to join us, like Dan said, on our continuing the conversation session if you are a member. And also, if you were not able to hop in right at the beginning and you missed a little bit, this will be recorded and put up on YouTube, so you can check that out next week. Thank you so much and have a great night, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.